So we're going to talk about, let's see if I got this right. There we go. We're going to talk about disease ID and management for tomato and cucurbit crops. A lot of some of the diseases I talk about are found on other crops as well. I'll pass that along as we go. And management techniques are similar to what we might use for beans and some other host crops. Again, I'm Ed Sikora, extension plant pathologist here at Auburn for a number of decades. So we're going to talk about mainly tomatoes and cucurbits and a lot of different things we see out there in the field in Alabama, as Chip mentioned. I thought I always like to start out with just a definition of what is a plant disease. And I define it as any disturbance of a plant that interferes with its normal growth and development. We have biotic diseases, which are caused by living agents such as fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. And I'll show you examples of each of those today on both crops. And also abiotic diseases, nutrient deficiencies, drought stress, maybe a misapplication of a pesticide or fertilizer, or even ozone damage. I'd like to spend the whole time on abiotic diseases because they're so interesting, but I thought I'd just pass one slide by you here before we get into the biotic agents. But things that you might see that would be considered abiotic would be blossom end rot on tomatoes. You might also see it on peppers or watermelon. It's a calcium deficiency, often induced by a low or very high pH soils. We'll often see it on tomatoes when you have very erratic water availability during the summer in the southeast. Bottom left, you see growth cracks. I started seeing this, when there's just so much moisture in the field or in the garden, growth cracks are possible. The fruit just can't keep up with the moisture coming in. So you get radial and circular cracks. In the center, this was down in the Headland area last year, was hail damage. You see these pockmarked fruit, of course, all unmarketable. Those lesions that open up also can be invaded by secondary bacteria and fungi. Top right, herbicide injury is a pretty common problem for vegetables, actually for most crops. Mainly just a misapplication. It could be a mishap using the wrong material or product on the wrong crop, or many times it's drift from a neighboring field that often burns the leaves, cuts the plants back, and stunts them, and oftentimes leaves them to the point where they cannot produce fruit. Bottom right is ozone damage, and people always laugh. I've been talking about that for a long time, but we do see this in like Alabama, for example, in the southeast. A lot of times we'll see this later in June, July, August, when you have high temperatures and kind of stagnant air masses, if you will, no fronts moving through, and the ozone builds up in the atmosphere and is then filtered out by certain plants. And ornamentals will have this, but we see it oftentimes on watermelons and cantaloupe. Also, Irish potatoes are very sensitive to it. And it looks like a burn at first, or I first thought it was powdery mildew, but it can cause the leaves to basically dry down, the crop to mature rapidly, and maybe the crop goes down 2, 3, 4 weeks before you want it to because you lose the foliage, and can reduce marketability. Only control there would be to move to more rural state, I guess, but ozone damage. So let's talk about tomatoes. I've done a lot of work in North Alabama with Chip and others. That's Sand Mountain up in North Alabama. And you see some healthy tomatoes on the right. And I think that'll be the last healthy tomato you see for the next 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to say top 5 tomato diseases, but I think I added a couple more last night just for fun. And we'll go over all of these plus a few others as we go through the talk. I always start off with fusarium wilt, and this is not usually a major problem for large commercial growers, but we do see this with I would say, truck farmers, if I could use that lingo, or even backyard gardeners or large gardens. It's a soil-borne fungal disease, which you'll often see. These tomatoes will yellow up. Oftentimes, it'll be unilateral. It'll be on half the plant will yellow up or half the leaflet. The plants start to wilt down after a week or two and then shut down completely. And fairly easy to identify just by making a longitudinal cut at the base of the plant, just above the soil line, and you'll see brown discoloration of the vascular system, the water conducting vessels just underneath the stem or the bark tissue, if you will. So it's a soil-borne fungal disease that invades the plants through the roots. The Fusarium, the various species we have, can survive in the soil for years in the absence of a host. As I mentioned, it plugs up the water conducting vessels, causing the plant to yellow and eventually wilt and die. And this might take up to a week or two for this to happen. We have three main races of Fusarium, I believe in Alabama, but we do have resistant, these are the main ones. There's a couple more, but we do have resistant varieties to all three races, which is a great thing to have. So picture on the right was the first time I saw Fusarium in Alabama back in '92, but wilted tomato plants in a commercial farm down in Alberta, Alabama. I cut that lower stem open, and you can see those brown streaks in the vascular system, same thing off to the left. So that's pretty much a dead giveaway for this disease. So as far as management, best thing you do is plant a Fusarium wilt-resistant cultivar variety. You can see a variety trial off to the right. That's an older slide, but hopefully you could tell which variety was susceptible to Fusarium and which varieties were resistant to it. So resistance does work well. It's the best control we have for this disease. We also suggest planting in well-drained soils. Using crop rotation can be helpful, but basically looking at planting tomatoes in infested areas only every 3 to 4 years. That could be hard to do with limited land space. More recently, Dr. Kimball and others have looked at grafted plants. So you take an heirloom cultivar and you put it on a resistant Fusarium wilt-resistant rootstock, and you have the best of both worlds there. Dr. Kimball, our previous horticulturist, did that work, plus others. So next one I want to talk about is tomato spotted wilt virus. I love talking about viruses. I probably spent most of my career chasing them across the state. Spotted wilt is spread by thrips, an insect. They do cause stunting, as you can see in that upper picture to the right from Geneva County. The terminal leaves will be distorted and turn pale green. The leaves turn brown or purple browns. I'll show you pictures of this. Bottom one, there's ring spots on fruit, which always get people excited when they see this. Still makes me smile as a plant pathologist, but I'm sure as a grower, you would be happy to have that. So here you can see the stunting of the plants on the left. This is in Dothan, Alabama, I believe, or Headland. You can see a plant stunted and also that yellow discoloration of the leaves there on both those plants. So, and also you get shortened internodes. The plants are stubby. Typically, when a virus infects a plant, it doesn't kill the plant because the virus infests the plant, but it needs the plant to survive for the virus to continue on and maybe to get moved or spread by thrips to other plants. On the right, you can see more of that bronzing on the leaves, even little ring spots on some of those leaves if you use your imagination. Again, some of the bronzing on the left, upper right, you can see, I believe that's eastern flower thrips. Oftentimes these show up in the flower buds, and also the wing forms. And then in the bottom right, you can see ring spots on green fruit, which I don't often see, but occasionally I do. And then more dramatic picture to the bottom right. So as far as management, best thing we have going for the last 15 years is they have been developing resistant cultivars or varieties of spotted wilt. These are just some I took out of our handbook from last year that are considered resistant to spotted wilt. And depending on where you live, where you're watching this video from, you need to determine if those varieties are available and culturally if they would work in your state or area. I believe there are other varieties available as well. You could also think about one thing I should mention real quick here before I forget is that we are seeing strains of the virus overcome this resistance. This has just been happening in the last couple of years. It's happening in peanuts, which is spotted wilt is a major disease on peanuts, and we're seeing it there. We're thinking we're seeing it on tomatoes now, including in Alabama. So that's something to be aware of. If you do have a resistant variety in your field and you see spotted wilt, please contact your local REA or me directly so that we could take a closer look at that situation. Reflective mulches may reduce thrips feeding. Thrips basically are flying insects, much like aphids, or similar to aphids. The reflective mulch, this is a raised bed with silver reflective mulch. Most growers use black mulch in the spring to warm the beds up, or white mulch in the summer to basically cool the beds down for the root system. North Alabama, because they had such significant virus problems for many years, they've gone to reflective. And what this reflective does, it reflects the UV light coming from the sky, and it inhibits flying insects like thrips, aphids, whiteflies, cucumber beetles, and so on from landing on those plants early in their development. And that's important because viruses cause the most damage or the most yield loss the earlier they get inside the plant. So using a reflective mulch or possibly row covers can keep those plants free of insects and then therefore free of the virus themselves. I also said weed control around the field. With many viruses, we feel about 90% of the viruses originate from about 10 feet or maybe 10 meters from around that field. So if you control the weeds around the field before you transplant or plant, and I don't mean mow, but you have to eliminate the weeds. You eliminate the overwintering hosts for many of these, or for spotted wilt and some of the other viruses we'll talk about today. Southern blight's a disease we see it on a lot of different crops. I think it goes to 500 different, has over 500 hosts. I think that's an underestimation. A lot of weed hosts. Some people call this white mold. And obviously for the white fungal growth or mold that you see on the stem of this tomato plant. Off to the right, that's again up in North Alabama in a field, and you can see a number of tomato plants wilting and dying. Sort of looks like Fusarium wilt, but with this disease, under the right conditions, you'll see this white mold at the base of the stem, which gives it away pretty easily. And I'll show you a couple other slides here. One thing to notice is how those plants are dying in a row. This disease doesn't produce airborne spores typically, so it just moves from plant to plant. This is again on a raised bed with drip irrigation, so it just moves from plant to plant, or root to root within that row. It doesn't cross rows for the most part. So it's a soil-borne fungal disease. I call it Sclerotium ralphsi, that's the old name. Wide host range. As far as our cultivated vegetable crops, I mean, you could add tomato, pepper, eggplant, beans, melons, and various cucurbits. But here you can see those plants wilting and dying, and the row pattern again. And then what you look for is at the base of the plant, the base of the stem. The fungus doesn't attack the plants at the roots, but it comes in at the soil line, invades at that area. And what happens is you'll get the white mold will develop under moist conditions. But when it dries down, what you just have is a blackish, grayish canker at that soil line. And it girdles the stem right there. And that, of course, cuts off the water vessels and causes the plant to wilt fairly rapidly, much faster than you see with Fusarium. So rapid wilting, crown rot, white mold. Oftentimes you'll see, almost always you'll see these small round sclerotia form in the mycelium. This is dormant mycelium. These will be anywhere from young sclerotia will be white to tan to orange to brown. They look like little seeds in a way, but they're embedded in the white mycelium in the stem. And that pretty much gives you a true identification for this disease. And those could, in the absence of host, can survive in the soil for 7, 8, 9 years. So it's one reason why this disease is a constant problem. Just an example of its host range. Here it is on peppers on the left and cantaloupe on the right. I put this slide in here to remind me that what happens is that the fungus is in the soil, and oftentimes it gets stimulated from those sclerotia into mycelium by moisture and then coming into contact with organic matter. So this could be fruit lying on the ground. One good reason to have a good mulching program, maybe plastic mulch or even growing things on trellises. You've been seeing a lot of that activity lately. But also leaf defoliation. If you have, say for tomatoes, if you have early blight or bacterial spot and you have defoliation from those diseases, those leaves falling to the ground can stimulate southern blight to become active. And then it can attack the plant at the stem, or in this case, the fruit that are touching that wet soil, infested soil. So as far as management, I say crop rotation because that's just the standard thing, but such a wide host range, that is not the most effective method. A couple cultural things to think about is avoid low pH situations, because that seems to favor southern blight development. Oftentimes, this is a disease that is favored by heat when the soil bed heats up. So we suggest, or I had see a suggestion where you plant early before the summer heat sets in, to get away from the conditions that favor this pathogen. You can try to improve air circulation with good spacing between your plants. Early in the season, you can remove and destroy infected plants, infected tomato plants or peppers, what have you. This can be difficult in a commercial situation where you have acres and acres of tomatoes. Also, when you try and dig those plants up, you have to dig up the root ball and all and the soil around it, because that's where the pathogen is located. It can disrupt your stringy operations and your stakes and so on, and destroy your plastic. So that's not always a reasonable thing to do. Fungicides have a couple of fungicides available, usually in the FRAC groups 7 and 11. Products like, these are just examples, Cabrio and Luna Sensation are two of many that have been labeled for southern blight. I'm not sure how effective they are, though, for this disease. You usually have to direct those towards the stem. One thing you can do is deep tillage. Audrey was talking about this in the previous presentation, but deep tillage, you want to bury those sclerotia, those seed-like structures, at least 6 inches deep. And this is mainly because the fungus has to attack the plant at the soil line. And if the sclerotia are buried so deep, they have a hard time moving back up into that area. So it takes some time. And then, of course, you have pre-plant fumigation. I got Pick 100 here, but there are some other products available. And if you get the 2025 Southeast Vegetable Crop Handbook, these are listed in the book, and also the fungicides label for southern blight. I tossed this one in last night, bacterial wilt. And oftentimes we see this more in May and June, maybe into July. You get a rapid wilting of the plant. So we've talked about Fusarium wilt, southern blight, now bacterial wilt, 3 diseases that cause wilting of tomatoes. This one, you just get a rapid wilt of the plant. There's no yellowing to it. Plants go down very quickly, and you don't see any white mold at the base of the stem. So that gives you 2 ideas what you might not have or what you do have. You look at the stem, you will see browning of the vascular system and even the pith as it breaks down due to the bacterium. And then you can check this, and we do this in the lab maybe half dozen times a year. It's kind of a cool thing to see. I've taken videos of it, but you can take that stem from that center slide, and off to the right, you can stick it in a clear-sided glass of water and give it about 30 seconds to a minute. And if the bacterium is there, you'll start seeing milky white strands of bacterial spores oozing out of that tissue and just spiraling down. And that's a pretty much confirmation that you have bacterial wilt in that plant, in that field. Oftentimes you see wilt in low-lying areas. The bacterial disease likes it wet. So low-lying areas of field. So oftentimes you could try to avoid this problem. If you have a field with a history of bacterial wilt, there are no bactericides for it. There are no resistant varieties for it. There's nothing you could spray for it. So it's mainly just avoidance and avoiding those low-lying areas that the disease might be present at. So bacterial wilt. Staying on the topic of bacteria, bacterial spot is a continuous problem in Alabama and the Southeast, and both commercial fields and even in home gardens, typically introduced on transplants. It attacks leaves and fruit, and often is favored by warm, wet conditions. And most of the pathogens that we talk about are favored by warm, wet conditions, which is not good if you live in Alabama, especially in the spring and early summer. The leaf spots will cause an irregular and ragged look to the plants. The fruit spots can be raised or scabby. I'll give you examples of both. So here you can see the leaf spots on a tomato leaf to the left. Oftentimes they're very angular in their pattern, just because once the bacteria get into the leaf itself, they have a hard time as they move through the tissue crossing those major veins. So sometimes you see this angular type pattern, which sometimes for a trained eye can give you an idea that you're dealing with this disease. You can also see it in the upper right. And then you can take that leaf on the left and cut through it and stick it on a microscope slide, compound scope, and you could also see bacterial ooze coming out that's the way we confirm this in the lab at Auburn. What you often see early in the year is early infection is going to be on the lower leaves, maybe in the middle of the canopy, kind of a yellowing in the leaves, and then you see these brown to black specks, chocolate brown specks in the inside, then more so on the right as the bacteria can move up very quickly through the canopy. If you're overhead irrigating and you have bacterial spot in the field or speck, they can move very actively if you have a very wet conditions or a lot of rainfall or driving rains coming through your area. Same disease also goes to peppers. I put this slide in here. Oftentimes you see it's interesting because you have the moisture in this field and the bacteria are on the leaves, but they're also on the surface and they could just roll down that leaf to the leaf tips. So the leaf tips are often discolored or browned up because of infection through the hydathodes or stomates. So bacterial spot, they also goes to peppers. Probably the most common disease on peppers, though we do have very good resistant varieties to spot for peppers, not so much for tomatoes though. So here's spot on fruit. Chip referred to marketable yields. Obviously this is not marketable or even edible. Sometimes you see these sunken spots or cankers, if you will, craters, I should call it, on the left, and even more so on the right. You can see the moisture on the tomato, just to remind me to tell you that bacterial spot likes it warm, not real hot, but warm and wet. The wetter it is, the more active this pathogen can be. So there are no resistant varieties for tomatoes, though we do have it for peppers. Try to use disease-free transplants. Get your tomatoes from a reputable nursery or dealer. Avoid overhead irrigation. Avoid working plants when wet. So when thinking about pruning, stringing, or even harvesting the fruit, avoid those fields when it's wet out because you can easily spread the disease from one plant to another. As far as pesticides, copper-based products would be the main component to a spray program. Things like Kocide and some of the others, number of products available, which you could find in a handbook. We have done some surveys in recent years with our bacteriologists at Auburn. We have found 2 or 3 or 4 different species of Xanthomonas species that causes in the field or in our fields in Alabama. And some of these have been shown to be resistant to the copper products, which makes control quite difficult. All right. I think this is the last disease on tomatoes, and this is early blight. This is the first disease that came to my attention as a pathologist back in the day. A woman called me up and said her tomatoes were firing up. And I'm from Chicago. She was from Alabama, and we had a hard time communicating. But she said firing up, and she just meant that the plants were dying bottom up. The leaves are burning up from the bottom. And what we determined in that case, and what early blight looks like, is it's a fungal disease. I still call it Alternaria solana. I'm not sure that's correct anymore to the taxonomist, but you'll get these target-like lesions on the leaves, starting in the lower part of the plant, moving up, and oftentimes these are surrounded by a yellow halo. So that's a classic picture of early blight at the right. There's another disease called target spot that will cause similar symptoms in the southeast. So it's a fungal pathogen. It overwinters, the fungus overwinters in plant debris in the soil, but it could also enter the field on air currents from a neighboring field or on occasionally on transplants occasionally. Begins on the older leaves as irregular spots that enlarge to about a ½ inch in diameter. And early on, it can be confused with, as I said, target spot, bacterial spot, and some of the other diseases that you might see on foliage. Then it develops these concentric rings with the yellow halo, favored by temperatures in the 65 to 85 degree range. And of course, wet conditions favor early blight in most of your fungal problems. I did a lot of work with this back in the 90s, fungicide trials, IPM trials to try and cut down the number of fungicides we use. What we found is that early blight, if you don't spray for it, you can see reduced foliage because the leaves die off, so you get reduced fruit size and fruit quality just due to the lack of photosynthetic area on those plants. You see more sun scald because you don't have the foliage to cover the fruit, so those fruit are exposed to the sun. You get that whitening or bleaching on the surface. Our trials, one year we had a 50% reduction from early blight, where we had no sprays, no fungicide sprays versus a calendar-based spray program where we're spraying pretty much once a week, like most commercial growers do. You can get early blight lesions on the fruit, like in that above picture, but I really see that in Alabama because our commercial growers typically are picking fruit at the breaker stage when they're just turning pink. And typically with early blight, the fruit lesions, I see it more on ripened or ripening fruit than on green fruit. But you also see concentric ring patterns there as well. This is from a picture, I think 1995, but on the left you can see where we sprayed a fungicide once a week versus no fungicide off to the right, and you can see the amount of damage, amount of defoliation or dead leaves, about 85% of leaves are dead. And that's, I think that was a test we saw this 50%. So plant disease-free transplants, plant-resistant varieties when available, and they're available in your area. Follow a balanced fertility program. We found that tomatoes growing under nitrogen, deficient in nitrogen, might be more susceptible to early blight. I like to go do a scout and spray program. I mentioned the calendar-based program that most commercial growers use, spraying once a week shortly after transplanting. If you can, if you have fewer tomato plants out there or less acreage, you can scout those fields weekly. And when you see the beginnings of this disease building up low in the canopy, and it has to be pretty quick, then you can get on a fungicide spray program. End of the season, remove tomato residue after harvest so the disease can't overwinter readily. And a 2-year rotation can reduce inoculate in that field from 1 year to the next. So that's a possibility. All right, let's move on to cucurbit diseases. And I think I list 5 here, but we'll talk on maybe 6 or 7 just for the fun of it. Let's just move in. The first one is bacterial wilt. And one of the first diseases I saw in Alabama was in that picture in the upper left. That's why it looks kind of out of focus, but you'll see with bacterial wilt, and this is more of a problem on cucumbers and cantaloupe more than any of the other cucurbits, but you'll see individual vines dying back to the crown or leaves just sort of wilting. But it'll usually be individual vines, and then the whole plant just shuts down. And bacterial wilt can be confused with stem borers, so you have to determine if it's an insect problem you're dealing with or this bacterial problem. One thing we can do in the field is a bacterial ooze test. I do this a couple of times a year, but we take one of those vines that are recently wilted, but you still have some turgor pressure and turgor pressure. And you take those vines, you squeeze them on the bottom right picture there, push them together, kind of push the ooze coming out and then slowly pulling them apart, and you see these strands of bacterial ooze between the 2 stem pieces. So we'll try that occasionally in the field. You need a sharp knife and just a recently wilted vine to do it. It's sort of cool to see it, but I don't do it too often. So bacterial wilt, I like talking about it because it has such an interesting disease cycle. So it's a bacterial pathogen spread by striped and spotted cucumber beetles, like that little cute spotted beetle in the upper right-hand corner. And the beetles transmit the bacteria through their mouth parts or through frass, and this stuff comes in contact with wounds caused by the beetle feeding on the leaf surface. And this is how the bacteria gets into the plant itself. Bacteria build up very rapidly, and they can spread through the plant quickly. They clog up the water conducting vessels, which we've seen with some of the other diseases I've talked about, leading to this rapid wilt of the vines and eventually the entire plant. Cucumbers and cantaloupe are the most susceptible. Squash and pumpkin, less susceptible, and watermelon is resistant. So for control, you can try insecticides, but I'm not sure how well that really works. Trying to control insects with insecticides that spread virus can be difficult. Row covers can be used early in the season, trying to keep the beetles off the plants. Of course, you got to take those off eventually when the flower buds start coming out for fertilization purposes or pollination purposes. But we have seen some benefit with that, but it can be a pain. And then there is some resistance out there, and I would call it a moderately effective. I have not tested any myself, but an interesting disease just the same. Gummy stem blight, a problem in the Southeast. For some reason, I don't see it as much in Alabama as they see it in, say, South Carolina or parts of Georgia. Oftentimes what you'll see in the field from a distance is kind of a melting out of some plants, and you think it might be a wilt disease or southern blight, but that's just gummy stem blight building up. On the right, you can see these grayish to black target-like lesions in the lobes of the leaves, and gets its name from these stem lesions that you see in the bottom left, kind of reddish brown, the black, depending on weather conditions, usually starting at a node, and they go up to about 6 inches long. And this is where the stems will crack open under moist conditions, and you'll get a bacterial or a ooze coming out from that stem. What happens here is when those lesions on the stem completely girdle that branch there, if you will, you'll get dieback to that site. So just various pictures of gummy stem, the grayish to black lesions on the left, middle center or middle top, you can see some of the, under wet conditions, gumming, how it gets its name. Center picture, it's more dry conditions there, but you can see these tan lesions that are also due to gummy stem. And again, if they girdle a stem, you have death to that site. Off to the right, you can see some fungal fruiting structures on the stem itself under dry conditions. And also the pathogen or the pathogens that are in the gummy stem blight complex can also cause black rot, or what we used to call black rot, on watermelons. And also you can see it on honeydew melons. I think that's a honeydew on the bottom right. That might be a butternut, sorry. So irregular grayish black lesions in the lobes of the leaves, favored by wet conditions, heavy dews, occurs on more commonly on watermelon, cantaloupe, and honeydew melons, and also on some of these specialty melons that have come around for the last 10 years or so. Fungicides are the best control. No resistant varieties that I'm aware of, but usually have to begin at flowering and stay on a pretty strong program. Resistance management of your fungicides is important because we have seen resistant strains of gummy stem develop to some of our best fungicides. So you need to rotate these products between different frac groups, different chemistries as the season progresses, so you avoid developing resistant strains of gummy stem or other diseases of melon, for example, for that matter. Keep these products around as long as possible. Crop rotation can't help it. It does survive on crop debris, so a 2-year rotation, or not growing a 2-year rotation can be effective in reducing inoculum in that field. All right, let's go to plant viruses again. We talked about spotted wilt on tomatoes earlier, but there are a number of viruses that go to cucurbits. All cucurbits are susceptible. Most of these viruses can overwinter in weeds, and about 90% of plant viruses are vectored or spread by insects, often aphids or whiteflies or leafhoppers, as I showed earlier. You can see some of the distortion off to the right. You get some really weird growth when a plant's infected with a virus, especially early in its development. But some of the main ones we see, aphid-transmitted viruses, be cucumber mosaic virus, papaya ring spot virus, watermelon mosaic virus, and also zucchini yellow mosaic virus. These are the 4 main aphid-transmitted viruses I see in the state. I'll talk about it in a bit, but we are starting to see more whitefly-transmitted viruses as well. These names are somewhat misleading, but the virus was named initially for the first crop it was found on, and then the main symptom that it produced. So cucumber mosaic was first found on cucumbers, and then it causes mosaic symptom, which I'll explain more. But cucumber mosaic goes to over 800 different species of plants. Very wide host range for that pathogen itself. So the symptoms vary. You get mottled leaves or mosaic leaf patterns, and that's where you have a dark green tissue intermingled with light green and yellow, like you see maybe in the bottom right or the bottom two slides. So that's a mosaic or a remodeling pattern. Can get distorted leaves. Oftentimes, this is in the newest growth. This is where the virus is hanging out more or less in the newest growth. That's where the symptoms will be most dramatic. Not on the older leaves might look fine. Newest leaves will be distorted. The virus gets in the plant early, we'll get stunted plants. The fruit are stunted in size, mottled in the form, sometimes like that pumpkin in the upper right. You could probably sell that for twice the price of a normal pumpkin at Halloween. But you do get reduced yields, and more so the earlier the plant is infected with the pathogen. So here's some more dramatic pictures of viruses on squash. In fact, this plant was infected with, I think, 3 different viruses. So you can't get multi-virus epidemics or multi-virus infection of cucurbits and other crops as well. Upper right, that's more like zucchini mosaic, that bubbling you see in the leaves. But on the left, you can see that distortion of the leaf tissue. They call that shoestring for because it looks like a shoestring, I guess, versus a normal broadleaf dicot type leaf. And you can also get a fruit infection where you start seeing discoloration or odd ring spots and so forth to the fruit itself. And one thing with viruses, it can be confused with herbicide damage. So each year at our diagnostic lab, we have to determine, do we have a herbicide drift problem? 2,4-D, say, is a common one that looks quite a bit like viruses, or is it viruses themselves? And with viruses, what you often see is in most cases, not all the cases, but in most cases, there will be spotty in the field, random, if you will. It won't have where herbicide injury oftentimes is a drift pattern moving in from maybe a neighboring cotton field or what have you. So the pattern of infection can help in deducing what problem you're dealing with there. So I think you already talked about, we'll be talking about insects, but aphids, leafhoppers, and whiteflies are the 3 main vectors of viruses in Alabama. Aphids feed with this piercing, sucking mouth part that you see in that diagram in the upper left, or picture up in the upper left drawing. And the virus particles are stuck to the stylet, that mouth part, and they poke that into the leaf, much like getting a shot at the doctor's office, like with a hypodermic needle. And the virus then enters into the plant itself, and viruses reproduce or replicate very quickly and then spread throughout the plant. And once the virus is inside the plant, there's no curing that plant. If the virus is in it, it'll move down to the roots and then back up the plant. So aphids are common. You also have whiteflies in the bottom left corner, leafhoppers off to the right. I mentioned this because we've been doing some surveys over the last 4 to 5 years, looking mainly in South Alabama for these yellows viruses, whitefly transmitted yellows viruses of cucurbits. And just in the last 3 years, we've picked up, I think, 3 new viruses, including cucurbit yellow stunting disorder virus and cucurbit yellow viruses shown here. They will cause, obviously, yellowing, but it's a little bit different, say, from the aphid transmitted viruses, in that the symptoms are more common on the older leaves than on the younger leaves. And we see this more in South Alabama, South Georgia. It appears to be moving as the whiteflies, as we're seeing these warmer conditions. Oftentimes the whiteflies are in milder winters. I'm not so sure about this year, but the whiteflies are able to overwinter farther north out of Florida. And I think that's one reason we're starting to see more of these whitefly transmitted viruses. But we're seeing them mainly along the southern tier of counties in Alabama. But just something to be on the lookout for. This is aphid-borne yellows viruses. This is on a squash, I believe, at in Bruton, Alabama, a few years ago. But a dramatic picture here with that mosaic or a modeling pattern on the foliage. And you can see off to the left, you can see the newer leaves are more damaged or more symptomatic than the older leaves on that plant. So virus disease management, there are resistant varieties. The aphid vector or the 4 aphid diseases I showed you, the mosaic diseases, we do have resistant varieties in squash to those pathogens. We do have some resistance, I think, in cucumbers to these organisms. I often recommend planting early to avoid high insect populations because the virus can't get around without the insect to piggyback on it. So if you plant early, you can avoid this problem if you have a history of it in your area. Weed control is always important around a field. As I said earlier, 90% of the viruses that will infect that field come from about a 10-meter area around the edge of the field. So weed control, not mowing, but actually eliminating those weeds, can reduce the amount of inoculum that you're gonna have to deal with as the season progresses. The longer the season goes, the more viruses we see. It's just a general rule. Insect control, insecticides are a possibility, but insecticides, I mean, you have a lot of insect problems in cucurbits, tomatoes for that example as well. But trying to control viruses with insecticides usually is a losing battle. Reflective mulches, which I described earlier, can be effective in keeping the virus out of those plants early in the season. Eventually, this example, the melons will grow over that reflective mulch, and they will become infected. But an older plant infected with a virus still will produce normally for the most part. But a young plant that's infected, you're not going to get much out of that plant. And then we also have tried row covers with some success on pumpkins and some other crops, but you have to remove that after a while because of fairly quickly because of for pollination purposes. Last fungal disease I talk about is one you probably all know about, powdery mildew. Gets its name from the powdery growth that you see on the foliage. All cucurbits are susceptible. Probably pumpkins and squash are the most susceptible to this disease. I see it every year on both crops, but especially squash during the summer. Favored by high relative humidity and lush plant growth, so over-fertilization can lead to more lush growth and more situations where you see mildew. When it's that shading area often helps the disease progress. It overwinters on weeds, has wide host range, and there's multiple species in the area. And then the spores are moved by currents. The white stuff you see there are colonies of spores, often on chains, and the conidia just get blown from plant to plant. And no free water is usually needed for infection. So this is one disease that I'll see in August, September. We're in the middle of a drought for a month. All the other diseases are pretty much dormant or very little activity, but powdery mildew will be going crazy, even under those hot, dry conditions. So this is one disease that doesn't need a lot of moisture to be damaging. Top 3 slides or 3 pictures on top, you can see those colonies developing on, I think that might be on, I'm not even sure what crop that is, but you can see the white colony developing, and these are just chains of spores on the upper leaf surface, and you also see this on the lower leaf surface. And usually you almost scrape that off with your thumb as it just invades the upper epidermal cells. It doesn't go to the fruit, but say with pumpkins, it will go to the handle. So if you get a lot of pumpkins, if you get these handles rotting or whiten up, as I said, it won't go to the fruit directly, but if you lose those handles with pumpkins, oftentimes that you're going to lose some of your markability, later in the season at Halloween time. With mildew, you will get leaves that's finally drying up, kind of staying on the plant erect, but dead. But you have all this defoliation, which reduces your photosynthetic area, which reduces the energy and the food required to develop those fruit. And also, so you don't get the size you want. Plants die early because they lose their leaves. And you also have the problem with sun skull, as we talked about with tomatoes. So mildew is a problem we have every year, just so you know. There are resistant varieties available. Other varieties are tolerant. I would definitely choose those over a susceptible variety when possible. You still might want to have a basic fungicide program when using these type of cultivars. Find a variety that grows, though, well in your state or area. Follow a balanced fertility program. Don't overdo it with the nitrogen. Weed control around the field can help reduce inoculum levels because the disease is going to survive on weeds through the winter. And then fungicides. And again, with some of these products, you need to rotate the active ingredients, go through those different frac groups, look at the crop handbook Southeast Crop Handbook when it becomes available this year. And because we do see powdery mildew does develop resistance to fungicides quite quickly, but you can see the benefit of a fungicide in that picture on the bottom on the right, where fungicides have been used on the left, unsprayed. Oh, I got one more fungal disease here, downy mildew. This sounds like it might be a cousin of powdery, but this is actually a water mold. I would call it water mold fungi, but I guess it's an old mycete they classify it now. Big problem on cucumbers, pumpkins, and winter gourds, mainly as far as the cucurbit group. Doesn't overwinter in most areas in Alabama. It doesn't overwinter in Alabama for the most part, but it needs to be spread long distances in air currents. So a lot of the downy mildew we might see in Alabama actually originates from South Florida during their winter crops, vegetable crops down there in November, December, and January and February. That's where it develops there, and then it slowly starts to move through Florida, and then oftentimes goes along the East Coast, but occasionally it makes a left-hand turn into Alabama. And when we have a mild summer, mild fall, the disease can take over a crop pretty quickly. Moderate temperatures, wet leaves, favor disease development. So we see this more more in fall crops personally. But defoliation, stunting, and poor fruit growth are all possibilities. Classic symptoms here on cucumbers is that you get these yellow angular spots on the foliage, starting on the older leaves in the crown, and then moving outwards. And if you turn that leaf over, corresponding to the yellow spots, you'll see a fluffy tuft of fungal growth. And this is the fungal pathogen or body, if you will. We use that with a compound scope. Sometimes with a good hand lens, you might be able to see this, and you know you're dealing with downy mildew. We see it in a number of different crops. So cucumbers is a classic, this one classic example of downy mildew. I see that every year for the most part. Butternut squash in the upper right, a little more darkish purple there. You also have powdery mildew there as well. Bottom right, cantaloupe. Again, the symptoms look a little bit different to me. Can be confused with anthracnose and some of the other diseases we might get on cantaloupe. And it's also a problem on watermelon. The symptoms to me are fairly, they're not as distinct to say as cucumbers, but it does occur on a watermelon. A big problem over in South Carolina and North Carolina with watermelon and downy mildew. Fortunately, I don't think we see it as much as they do there, and it might be due to weather conditions that they're exposed to. So here's downy mildew on pumpkins. That can be devastating on pumpkins when we start getting cooler, wetter conditions in the fall. It can really develop quickly, and even with fungicides, it can be hard to control. So as far as management, you're looking at planting cucurbits as early as possible to avoid the cool down later in the season when downy mildew may be moving into the area. As I said, more of a problem on fall crops. There are resistant varieties, but it's limited number of varieties available, most widely available with cucumbers. Summer squash, zucchini, acorn squash seem to tolerate downy mildew. They get infected, they seem to tolerate it better. And oftentimes they still will produce a marketable fruit if disease isn't overwhelming them. And then fungicides are available. Again, you want to rotate active ingredients because downy mildew does develop resistance to certain compounds. So consider that when you're spraying. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is root knot nematode. There's about 10 different species of nematodes. These are microscopic worms found in the soil that feed on roots, disrupting the root's ability to pick up moisture and nutrients, resulting in stunted plants and reduced yield. So root knot is the most damaging of these in Alabama on vegetables, tomatoes, cucurbits, peppers, what have you. These will start off as microscopic worms. Let me just show you the next slide. Like you see on the right, it's only about 1 millimeter long. They feed with a stylet, like you see on the left side picture there, which is much like that hypodermic needle I described with an aphid. But they feed with that hypodermic needle on either the outside of the cells, but some get inside the roots. And I'm going to go back to root knot here. In the upper left-hand corner, that's an adult female. These get inside the root system and they become sedentary endoparasites. They're like the couch potatoes of the nematode world. Set up a feeding site and they secrete enzymes through their mouth parts, and which causes a chemical reaction that increases the size and number of cells around our head. leading to those large galls you see in the bottom left corner. And those roots there are disrupted. You have a number of nematodes present in those roots, those larger galls, and the roots just don't pick up the moisture and nutrients the plant wants. So you get yellowing like you see in the tomatoes there, stunted plants. Looks like maybe nitrogen deficiency in a patch, but oftentimes you'll see this patchy in the field because the nematodes are not uniformly distributed. We have probably about 8 or 9 different types of nematodes that feed on plants in Alabama, stunt nematodes, ring nematodes, and so on. Many of these other ones stay migratory, vermiform, or worm-like here and feed on roots. So you can find a lot of nematodes in a handful of soil. And we do have nematode testing at our diagnostic lab in Auburn. So one thing to look for is when you see your plants wilting in the garden or in the field, but you have plenty of moisture. So in this case, we're growing them on white plastic mulch with drip irrigation. We're irrigating regularly, but you could see midday or later in the day, those, I think that's squash, or it's pumpkins, I think. You see those plants yellowing up and wilting, but there's plenty of moisture there. So you get both the nutritional problem and the wilting. I dug that particular plant up, and that was the root system off to the right. So you could have just imagine how disruptive that is to the plant's ability to survive. And the plant does, I mean, it's big there, but it can be quite dramatic with root knot nematodes. So it's a disease that's a number of different species out there. We're normally dealing with southern root knot, Lodyga incognita in Alabama. So site selection is important. You want to inspect for nematodes, say in the fall of the year before you go into a new area. So have a nematode soil test done. You can talk to a regional agent. You can find the information on our ACES website. If you have root knot nematode there, you might want to avoid that area for planting any crop for that matter. There are root knot resistant varieties available mainly just for tomatoes, and they work pretty well. Want to reduce plant stress through a good fertility program. Oftentimes we suggest adding organic amendments because these will increase the number of bacterial and fungal antagonists and other nematodes that may feed or attack root knot nematode or these other nematodes in the soil. So adding organic amendments is always a nice, good, you have a lot of positive effects there. Sanitation at the end of the year. If you do have root knot problems, you want to dig those plants up. If you don't get them out of the field, at least dig them up so the roots are exposed. These galls are exposed to the sun, and that'll often, just the heat itself will kill the nematodes in those, in the root system. Crop rotation can be effective, but root knot has, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 different hosts. So rotations are limited. It's still corn. We actually found it going to corn now, but corn's is kind of a moderately, you will reduce the population. It won't be as much as, say, if you went to tomato. Suppressive crops, I believe you listened to Dr. Gamble's talk earlier. She talked about cover crops. We have things like marigolds, sesame seed, sun hemp that can reduce populations of root knot. And then soil solarization is also an option, usually not for large commercial growers, more for home gardeners, I would say. Okay, with that, I think I'll stop. I would recommend you finding the Southeastern 2025 Vegetable Crop Handbook. I just got my book yesterday. We have a limited number of these available in Alabama from your regional agent eventually. There also will be a link to an online version of this, which I don't believe has come out yet, but this book, about 300 pages long, gives you information on varieties, fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, probably everything you want to know about growing vegetables in the Southeast is in this book. It's updated annually. Highly recommend you get the link or get the book if you can find one.